I'm particularly pleased to speak about Newman tonight because I've said everything I want to say about Merton, and this seems like a new one to start on, but also because I've spent a long time reading and teaching Newman at both the graduate and the undergraduate levels. And the more that I teach and read Newman, the more I realize how significant a figure he was for the contemporary church. And so tonight provided me with a public opportunity to examine the influence of Newman on the Council, on contemporary Catholicism and ecumenical relations, and the perduring influence of Newman in so many different areas. It became very obvious to me as I started working on this that there was so much material that this could take me right through the whole centenary year, and I'd be still speaking to you in the kind of EastEnders serialization in January of '91, still trying to get through all of this. So I've kind of condensed it in the interest of humanity and time to something a little more workable. And I hope tonight to give you what I think are some of the seminal reflections of Newman's on the nature of Christianity, the nature of religion itself, and the important role, increasingly important role, of the laity in the church, and this by a 19th century divine. Newman is more simply than a name. Newman is more than the historical personage who lived in England in the 19th century. For there is the spirit of Newman, the influence of Newman, the legacy of Newman. He was the perfect Victorian, the contemporary of John Stuart Mill, John Ruskin, Charles Dickens, Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, and Oscar Wilde. His life spanned a century, born in 1801, dying in 1890. His long life was marked by turbulence, crisis, immense challenges, and thundering defeats, and sublime triumphs. It was not an ordinary life. Scholar, Anglican clerk, novelist, poet, essayist, editor, translator, amateur musician, controversialist, Roman priest and cardinal, administrator, counselor, and correspondent to multitudes, Newman tasted little of physical serenity in his life. He was seldom out of the spotlight of his time. He was seldom ever left alone. Newman's life makes fascinating reading. We see him at all the points of intersection of the various and several religious and intellectual movements of the century. As commentator, apologist, and polemicist, we find him ever engaged in the art of persuasion, persuading the incredulous, the hostile, the unbelieving. Possessed of a relentless and rigorous mind, and of a temperament both stubborn and sensitive, Newman's combative nature assured him a prominent place in the theological controversies of his day. Today, he can still be found, if not always at the center, then certainly on the margins of our own religious struggles and debates. Arguments, indeed, over whether Newman is a conservative or a liberal occupy the attention of not a few contemporary Roman Catholics. For some, Newman remains the final breakwater before the waves of modernity flood the church. For others, he is the one who puts holes in the dikes. Newman the conservative, Newman the liberal. Clearly the terms are not quite right, for they fail to embrace the complexity and subtlety of Newman's mind. Anglican scholar Owen Chadwick says it best in his introduction to Susan Foister's National Portrait Gallery publication, Cardinal Newman, 1801 to 1890, a centenary exhibition. Father Chadwick observes, and I quote, "This conservative, as he seemed at first sight to be, was an innovator struggling to change the habits and ideas of the community of which he was a member, and discovering, like any reformer, that a lot of the other members resented being invited to change their habits or ideas. Wherever he went, he gathered disciples and enemies, but, like reformers generally, more of the second than the first." End of quote. What were some of these habits and ideas that he struggled to change? What is at the heart of Newman's innovative genius? In answering these questions, I would like tonight to examine three components of the Newman legacy. Number one, his championing of the laity. Number two, his thinking on the proper function, respectively, of the theological academy and the hierarchical authority. And number 3, his spirited defense of conscience. In the process, I think we will discover how much the conservative innovates and how much the innovator conserves. Ian Carr, in his Magisterial John Henry Newman, a biography, gives as fine an insight into the nature of Newman's thinking as can be found anywhere. He observes of Newman's mind that it, and I quote, is characterized not by contradictions but by complementary strengths, so that it may be called without inconsistency both conservative and liberal, progressive and traditional, cautious and radical, dogmatic yet pragmatic, idealistic but realistic. End of quote. The resourcefulness, catholicity, and intricacy of this very supple mind were severely taxed by the myopia of the Roman mentality, demonstrated in several areas, including the troublesome province of the laity. It all started with a journal, by name The Rambler. More than any other single occasion, the struggle over this publication resulted in Newman's innovative work on the laity. But he had previous instances when he found himself arguing for the dignity and prerogatives of the laity, notably his strife-ridden effort to found the Catholic University of Ireland. Drawn principally by Paul Cullen, Archbishop of Armagh and eventually Cardinal Archbishop of Dublin, to undertake the onerous task of establishing a Catholic university in Ireland, I don't know if there's one there now, a project designed to offset the damage to be entailed by the Queen's University of Ireland, initiative of Sir Robert Peel with its secular, non-denominational and mixed education components, Newman was persuaded from the beginning of the primary involvement of the laity. Newman was resolved that he should be appointed rector and that the management of the new university should not be in his hands only, but shared with the professoriate, the majority of whom, he insisted, should be laymen. In part, this structure would establish its essential difference from the National Seminary of Maynooth and remind all who needed reminding that a university is not a clerical enclosure. It is not a seminary. Newman's troubles with Cullen are legendary, and the protracted negotiations drained the English convert of much of his valuable energy. Still resident most of the year at his Birmingham oratory, Newman was compelled to travel constantly to satisfy his several commitments, and the tardiness and anxiety of the Irish hierarchy compounded greatly the already considerable labors of founding and directing a university. It's really extraordinary when you think about it. Newman was drawn over to Ireland by the Irish bishops to found a university. Here he was, an Englishman from Oxford, not the most desirable specimen to be walking the streets of Dublin. So he goes over, he starts to the university, but he continues to live in Birmingham because he's the superior of the Birmingham House of Priests or Oratory, and he has to travel back and forth. He has to take the coach to Wales, then take the boat from Wales over to Ireland, and then meet with all these warring professors and fighting bishops, then get back on the boat, go back to Wales, and take the coach to Birmingham. And he did this constantly for several years, neither disengaging himself from any of these activities. It's phenomenal that he got anything written at all. In his autobiographical writings, Newman speaks of his realization that the basic cause of friction between Cardinal Cullen and himself is to be found in his, and I quote, earnest desire to make the laity a substantive power in the university. End of quote. After all, Newman was convinced that the financial governance of the university should be in the hands of those for whom it is intended. But he was aware that this notion runs counter to the less venerable Irish clerical tradition, which would have, as he notes in his letters and diaries, the laity, I'm quoting, treated like good little boys, told to shut their eyes and open their mouths. End of quote. Newman's resolve to appoint honorary members of the university to be drawn from the laity in Ireland and elsewhere, and his resolve to appoint competent laymen to all the professorial chairs, save theology, in sharp opposition to the preferred convention of appointing inferior priests, were destined to elicit Cullen's ire and raise a few other episcopal eyebrows as well. In the sermon he preached at the opening of the new university church, paid for by the money left over from his notorious Achille trial fund, a sermon entitled Intellect, the Instrument of Religious Training, Newman outlines his purpose as a rector. He said, "It will not satisfy me what satisfies so many, to have two independent systems, intellectual and religious, going at once side by a sort of division of labor, and only accidentally brought together. It will not satisfy me if religion is here and the science there, and young men converse with science all day and lodge with religion in the evening. It is not touching the evil if young men eat and drink and sleep in one place and think in another. I want the same roof to contain both the intellectual and the moral discipline. Devotion is not a sort of finish given to the sciences, nor is science a sort of feather in the cap, if I may so express myself, an ornament and set off to devotion. I want the intellectual layman to be religious and the devout ecclesiastic to be intellectual." End of quote. Persuaded of the need to contain the clerical presence at the university rather than to expand it, Newman found himself, and not for the first time, at odds with the general thinking of his ecclesiastical superiors. It is not that Newman had an exaggerated respect for the lay state or a penchant for cleric bashing. After all, he was himself a cleric. It is simply that he held to an historical perspective that refused to suppress the charism or uniqueness of the lay vocation in the interests of a clericalized ecclesiology. Of his own bishop, W.B. Ullathorne of Birmingham, he remarked, this is the bishop he's speaking about, "He has a terror of laymen, and I am sure they may be made in this day the strength of the church." End of quote. It was Bishop Ullathorne, in fact, who is reputed to have asked Newman who precisely the laity are, provoking Newman's famous reply, "The church would look foolish without them." As early as 1853, Newman had referred in his, and I quote, "Lectures on the History of the Turks in Relation to Christianity," not a potboiler, to that period of the Arian heresy when it was the laity and not the papacy, the laity, not the papacy, that, and I quote, "transmitted so faithfully, generation after generation, the once delivered apostolic faith." Now this adumbration of an argument which would receive more detailed treatment on consulting the faithful in matters of doctrine stirred a few in its time, but there was much greater stirring yet to come. Richard Simpson, the convert editor of this journal, The Rambler, had a taste for controversy, and with his friend, the lay intellectual, historian, and peer John Lord Acton, The Rambler's sometime proprietor, found himself more at odds with the hierarchy than he did in sympathy, and particularly so after the publication of an article by the distinguished German theologian Ignaz Dollinger, not one of Rome's favorites. Newman, who repeatedly defended the integrity of the journal against its critics, was ultimately and reluctantly persuaded to take over its editorship. So now he had the university, the editorship, and the direction of the oratory, plus a correspondence commitment that ultimately would result in writing 20,000 letters. And when you think of what a Victorian letter looked like, you can imagine the labor expended on it. He called this task, running the journal, quotation marks, "a bad dream which oppresses me at times inconceivably," a sentiment, as the editor of Grail, I occasionally admit to myself. But he remained convinced of the publication's essential worth. He notes, "The refinement, enlargement, and elevation of the intellect in the educated classes is what we are about." The purpose of the journal was clear, balanced, and perhaps, given the climate of the day, unrealizable. Elegantly put, its intention was to combine devotion to the Church with discrimination and candor in the treatment of her opponents, to reconcile freedom of thought with implicit faith, to discountenance what is untenable and unreal, without forgetting the tenderness due to the weak and the reverence rightly claimed for what is sacred, and to encourage a manly investigation, these are pre-inclusive days, of subjects of public interest under a deep sense of the prerogatives of ecclesiastical authority. Within a couple of months, however, the bishops were clamoring for its closure. He resigned, satisfied that his successor as editor, Lord Acton, would remain faithful to its spirit. Ullathorne complained to Newman that, and I quote, "It was irritating. Our laity were a peaceable set. The church was at peace. They had a deep faith. They did not like to hear that anyone doubted." End of quote. But before leaving the editorship, and with the conversation with Ullathorne reverberating in his mind, Newman wrote his famous On Consulting the Faithful in Matters of Doctrine, in which he articulated his understanding of the role of the laity, their fundamental indispensability for an orthodox faith. In this 1859 article, the year of publication, incidentally, of Darwin's The Origin of Species, Newman advances his dangerous notion of the sense of the faithful, the sensus fidelium, which, he says, is a branch of evidence which it is natural or necessary for the Church to regard and consult before she proceeds to any definition from its intrinsic cogency. End of quote. Newman demonstrates, by way of a careful assemblage of relevant historical data, the value of the consensus fidelium. The laity held firm when episcopal authority wavered and theological opinion collapsed into the din of Babel. There is a voice for the laity, argues Newman, and there is a place for the laity, not only in articulating the sense of the faith, but in providing an intelligent and critical reception of church teaching. He says, and I quote, "I think I am right in saying that the tradition of the apostles, committed to the whole church in its various constituents and functions per modum unus, manifests itself variously at various times, sometimes by the mouth of the episcopacy, sometimes by the doctors, sometimes by the people, sometimes by liturgies, rites, ceremonies, and customs, by events, disputes, and movements, and all those other phenomena which are comprised under the name of history. It follows that none of these channels of tradition may be treated with disrespect, granting at the same time fully that the gift of discerning, discriminating, defining, promulgating, and enforcing any portion of that tradition resides solely in Ecclesia Docens, the teaching church. I think certainly that the Ecclesia Docens is more happy when she has enthusiastic partisans about her than when she cuts off the faithful from the study of her divine doctrines and the sympathy of her divine contemplations, and requires from them a fides implicita in her word, which in the educated classes will terminate in indifference, and in the poor in superstition." End of quote. Now, one can see from this why the authorities at Propaganda Fidei, the prominent figures in the growing ultramontanist movement, and converts like Manning, Ward, Faber, and Talbot would view Newman's influence with rising disquiet. Newman was considered in a very real sense the catch of his day. He had been important in the Tractarian movement at Oxford. More than any other single intellectual, he was responsible for that whole policy of ressourcement, of going back to the sources, particularly the writings of the early church fathers. And he was always prepared to engage in the great theological controversies of his time. But Newman was not popular in Rome. After his conversion and his subsequent ordination in 1847, and following particularly upon his involvement with the Rambler, Newman became increasingly suspect in Rome, and this would last almost up until the time of Pope Leo XIII, who eventually rehabilitated him and made him a cardinal in 1879. There is a notion, particularly current amongst Catholics, that Newman was always much favored and admired in his time. The contrary is true. Newman suffered enormously at the hands of the church he joined. He was treated fairly by the Church of England, and for several years treated ignominiously by the Church of Rome. And part of that surfaces in Newman's efforts to try to get a hearing in Rome. There were people like Cardinal Manning, for instance, and F.G. Ward, the layman and editor of the Dublin Review, who were very hostile to Newman. They were, as the phrase then was, and still is now, more Roman than Rome. And they spent a good deal of their time denouncing Newman to Rome. for several years there was no one in Rome to defend Newman. At one point in his long life, there was only one person in Rome who actually liked Newman, and that was Pius IX, the Pope. There was no one else around him who would defend Newman. So all these things are going on, whether in Ireland, whether talking about the lay people, whether engaging in dialogue with the English hierarchy over various points, establishing university, arguing about the prerogatives of the seminaries being different from the intellectual life of an educated Catholic laity. He always has to keep one eye on the several people who are constantly denouncing him to Rome. Newman's final kick at the can, if you will, can be found in his appendix to the third edition of the Arians of the 4th century, which was published 12 years after on Consulting the Faithful in Matters of Doctrine, at which time he reminds his readers of the visceral fidelity of the laity in contrast to the disabling fractiousness of the church leaders. He quotes, "The episcopate, whose action was so prompt and concordant at Nicaea on the rise of Arianism, did not, as a class or order of men, play a good part in the troubles consequent upon the council, and the laity did. The Catholic people in the length and breadth of Christendom were the obstinate champions of Catholic truth, and the bishops were not. On the whole, taking a wide view of history, we are obliged to say that the governing body of the Church came short, and the governed were preeminent in faith, zeal, courage, and constancy." Now you can imagine how that would sit down in Rome. This is a very remarkable fact, but there is a moral in it all. Perhaps it was permitted, in order to impress upon the Church at that very time passing out of her state of perfection to her long temporal ascendancy, the great evangelical lesson that not the wise and the powerful, but the obscure, the unlearned, and the weak constitute her real strength. It was mainly by the faithful people that paganism was overthrown. It was by the faithful people under the lead of Athanasius and the Egyptian bishops, not in some places supported by their bishops or priests, that the worst of heresies was withstood and stamped out of the sacred territory. End of quote. By 1871, Newman's Catholic reputation is finally on the mend, due largely to the phenomenal success of his autobiography, the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, the history of his religious opinions, and the recent An Essay in Aid of a Grammar of Assent. Rome's darkest suspicions have lightened a little. Besides, her attention is diverted to more sublime considerations: the First Vatican Council and the desperate struggles, the absorption of Rome and the papal city-states by the Italian nationalists. Rome had to move away from more divine areas of thinking when they found that Italy was being taken over by the nationalists and various churches were being confiscated by the new nation. Somehow the practical order brings a tone of urgency even to the most sublime conciliar discussions. Newman, a priest, founder of the English Oratory, and for the last 11 years of his life a cardinal of the Holy Roman Church, was not one inclined by spiritual disposition or emotional temperament to downplay the priesthood at the expense of exalting the lay state. But neither was he inclined to clericalize the Christian vocation, to treat the laity in matters of the faith with summary contempt a la George Talbot, the famous papal chamberlain who surmised that the role of the laity is, and I quote, "to hunt, to shoot, and to entertain." End of quote. I've only done one of those three things, so I have absolutely no idea what this means about the true nature of my humanity. As modern Roman Catholics struggle to define the specific vocation of the laity, to understand fully the meaning behind Pius XII's utterance that the laity are the church, Newman's insights are appreciated for their innovative quality. In spite of a conciliar decree, a synod, a pontifical council, and an encyclical, it is fairly safe to say, I think, that modern ecclesiological or church reflection on the lay state is in flux, if not in a muddle. It might be instructive now to turn to Newman's thinking on the science of theology and on the freedom of the theologian to see if we might not find some way to draw out the complete richness of Newman's theology of the laity, and as a consequence find some direction and focus for our own contemporary ecclesiological theologizing. Newman was not intimidated by the prospect of change. In his own life, he had experienced it in the most dramatic terms, like the gradual wrenching upheaval which drew him from the Church of England, the church he loved, to the Church of Rome, the church he would have to grow to love. He knew that change, and the radical change of conversion, is not a trifling thing, a gesture, a whim, a momentary diversion. Change, development, is poetically described in the following passage from his essay on the development of Christian doctrine. And we can discover in its lush description change as a constitutive dimension of life itself, in its myriad forms, of the mind, of the body, and of the spirit. Newman writes, "It is indeed sometimes said that the stream is clearest near the spring. Now, whatever use may fairly be made of this image, it does not apply to the history of a philosophy of belief, which, on the contrary, is more equable and purer and stronger when its bed has become deep and broad and full. It necessarily rises out of an existing state of things and for a time savors of the soul. Its vital element needs disengaging from what is foreign and temporary. It remains perhaps for a time quiescent. It tries, as it were, its limbs and proves the ground under it and feels its way. From time to time, it makes essays which fail and are in consequence abandoned. It seems in suspense which way to go. It wavers and at length strikes out in one definite direction. In time it enters upon strange territory. Points of controversy alter their bearing. Parties rise and fall around it. Dangers and hopes appear in new relations, and old principles reappear under new forms. It changes with them in order to remain the same. In the higher world it is otherwise. But here below, to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often." End of quote. Several years after the publication of the essay on development in 1845, it was in fact republished in 1878 after extensive revisions, Newman underscored the centrality of change in our lives in his letter to Pusey on occasion of his Irenicon, in which he noted, and I quote, "Life in this world is motion and involves a continual process of change. Living things grow into their perfection, into their decline, into their death. No rule of art will suffice to stop the operation of this natural law, whether in the material world or in the human mind. We can indeed encounter disorders when they occur by external antagonism and remedies, but we cannot eradicate the process of life itself, out of which they arise. Life has the same right to decay as it has to wax strong. This is especially true with great ideas. You may stifle them, or you may refuse them elbow room, or again you may torment them with your continuing meddling, or you may let them have free course and range and be content, instead of anticipating their excesses, to expose and restrain those excesses after they have occurred. But you have only this alternative. And for myself, I prefer much wherever it is possible to be first generous and then just, to grant full liberty of thought and to call it to account only when abused." End of quote. Now, Newman's tolerance for novel or conflicting ideas, his sturdy faith in the evolutionary capacity of ideas, and his conviction that truth need fear nothing are comforting notions for those depressed by recent Roman initiatives to centralize and to render uniform theological inquiry. And I mean by recent, our recent, not theirs. The celebrated Cologne Declaration of a few years ago, followed by various other statements by French, Italian, and Spanish theologians, as well as that of the Catholic Theological Society of America, provide the anxious Catholic with further examples of the deteriorating climate that presently exists between theologians and the magisterium, or the teaching authority of the Roman Catholic Church. Although various national episcopal bodies have issued statements affirming the role and integrity of theologians and pledging their cooperation with the larger theological enterprise, Rome itself continues to issue warnings, remonstrances, and threats of silence. The 1990 document on the ecclesial vocation of the theologian by the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, although by no means a comprehensive indictment of the theologian, serves as a dramatic reminder of the sorry state of that most critical relationship, freedom and authority. In a letter to the beleaguered Simpson of Rambler fame, complaining about the way they do things in the dicastery known as Propaganda Fidei. By the way, we don't use that title anymore. Propaganda Fidei was the missionary congregation, or the propagation of the faith. It's now called the Sacred Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, and it's that department, that curio department or body in Rome, which oversees missionary activity. And in the 19th century, for the majority of the 19th century, England was missionary territory, as indeed was Canada. For a very long time, it fell under the jurisdiction of Propaganda Fidei. So when he's talking about propaganda, he's talking about this very powerful body of bureaucrats in Rome who have a considerable degree of influence on ecclesiastical policy and appointments. One can find passages of unnerving relevance for our time. Newman writes to Simpson, "The wisdom of the Church has provided many courts for theological questions, one higher than another, and with an appeal from the lower to the higher. I suppose in the Middle Ages, which has a manliness and boldness of which there is now so great a lack, a question was first debated in a university, then in one university against another university, or by one order of friars against another order of friars. Then perhaps it came before a theological faculty. Then it went to the metropolitan, and so by various stages and after many examinations and judgments, it finally came before the Holy See, or Rome. But what do our bishops do now? All courts are superseded, because the English-speaking Catholic population all over the world is under propaganda, an arbitrary and military power. You can imagine again Rome having access to this, seeing themselves spoken of in such terms is not likely to put a smile on their not always beatific visages. Propaganda is our only court of appeal, but to it the bishops go and secure it and commit it before they move one step in the matter which calls for interference. And who is Propaganda Fidei? One sharp little man of business who works day and night and dispatches his work quick off to the east and then to the west, a high dignitary, but after all little more than a clerk, with 2 or 3 clerks under him. Rather dismissive, certainly irreverent. Newman's distaste for those who delate others to Rome, he suffered from such an affliction throughout most of the pontificate of Pius IX himself, and his distaste for Rome's penchant for premature involvement in ecclesio-theological debates prompted the observation during the long aftermath of the Rambler affair in 1861, and this is really quite strong, I think. Why was it that the medieval schools were so vigorous? Because they were allowed free and fair play. Because the disputants were not made to feel the bit in their mouths at every other word they spoke, but could move their limbs freely and expatiate at will. End of quote. Newman was not one, and I would like to emphasize this very strongly, was not one to despise authority or its rightful exercise. He had, after all, defended the authority of Rome against its numerous detractors by examining its apostolic record, its critical role during the doctrinal crises of the patristic period, and its claim of continuity with the primitive church. And so his credentials as pro-Roman could not be denied, save by the Ultramontanists and the ignorant. The Ultramontanists were a body of individuals who wanted to, they were also known as the opportunists or the maximalists. They had lots of names. And their basic thrust was really to attach as much power and authority to the charism of infallibility to the Pope of the popes as they could. Some would go so far as to say no matter what the Pope said, whether it was a passing comment on his breakfast, or whether it was a statement on the political situation in England, or whether it had to deal with the Blessed Virgin Mary, was all true. Okay? And the Ultramontanists as a body were rather dangerous because they sought to expand papal power more and more and more. And it is very interesting to know that the celebrated definition of papal infallibility at the First Vatican Council actually is a way of containing ultimatunist power. Even though there are various Roman Catholics who react against that now, in 1870 it was a considerable setback for the ultimatunists. They wanted much more defined than was defined. And Newman, in fact, saw the dogmatic definition of papal infallibility as a victory for the moderates, precisely because the way it was worked out and defined. Seems peculiar in some sense for many Catholics engaged in ecumenical dialogue now, but a careful examination of the historical record would indicate, I think, that the ultimatunists actually lost. Anyway, Newman argued for the vital and free interplay of intellect and authority, of freedom and discipline, in a way that assured the necessity of both, poised in tension, but ever struggling to apprehend the deepest truth. In a famous passage in his Apologia, he provides the Roman Catholic Church of the post-conciliar era with a model of such exquisite balance and utter reasonableness that one cannot but be pained by our contemporary atmosphere of mistrust. He writes, "It is necessary for the life of religion that the warfare between the claims of reason and of the teaching authority of the Church should be incessantly carried on. Every exercise of infallibility is brought out into act by an intense and varied operation of the reason, both as its ally and as its opponent, and provokes again, when it has done its work, a reaction of reason against it. And as in a civil polity the state exists and endures by means of the rivalry and collision, the encroachments and defeats of its constituent parts, so in like manner Catholic Christendom is no simple exhibition of religious absolutism, but presents a continuous picture of authority and private judgment, alternately advancing and retreating as the ebb and flow of the tide." Infallibility for Newman does not vitiate the compelling requirement to be ever watchful that correct authority is not bolstered by that body of individuals, and I quote, "a violent ultra-party which exalts opinions into dogmas and has it principally at heart to destroy every school of thought but its own." End of quote. The importance of flourishing and varied schools of theological and philosophical thought was never more apparent for Newman than during the years leading up to the dogmatic definition of papal infallibility in 1870, the heyday of ultramontanist power and influence. In 1877, he published a revised Prophetical Office of the Church, the first volume of his The Via Media of the Anglican Church, in which he provides a sterling endorsement of the high function of the theologian. He says, "I say theology is the fundamental and regulating principle of the whole church system. It has, in a certain sense, a power of jurisdiction over the prophetical office, the regal office, the priestly office, as being its own creations. Theologians being ever in request and in employment, in keeping with bounds both the political and popular elements in the Church's constitution, elements which are far more congenial than itself to the human mind, are far more liable to excess and corruption. The purpose of the theology, then, is not to police, to regurgitate, to serve as authority's easily subduable handmaiden, but to engage in the exalted task of shaping and refining the Church's self-understanding, of preparing the Church for change, because ultimately, as Newman says, theology is the arena on which questions of development and change are argued out. It prepares the way, accustoming the mind of Catholics to the very idea of change." End of quote. Modern Roman versus academic conflicts would depress Newman, with their echoes of 19th century ecclesiology. The censure of figures like Jacques Poyer, Hans Kuhm, and Charles Curran, I hazard, would dismay him. Not because the magisterium removed their license to teach as Catholic theologians. I think in 2 of those 3 cases he would approve. But because the procedure for so doing did not fully respect the self-disciplining, self-correcting power of the theological schools themselves. Even the International Theological Commission established after the Second Vatican Council by Pope Paul VI has not adequately, or at least consistently, provided the right forum for airing theological disputes before their referral to the final court, Rome. In a way, Newman reminds us of that quality of the Catholic genius explored by Notre Dame theologian Richard P. McBrien in his volume Catholicism, when McBrien argues, it is not nature or grace, but graced nature, not reason or faith, but reason illumined by faith, not law or gospel, but law inspired by the gospel, not scripture or tradition, but normative tradition within scripture, not faith or works, but faith issuing in works, and works as expressions of faith, not authority or freedom, but authority in the service of freedom, not the past versus the present, but the present in continuity with the past, not stability or change, but change in fidelity to stable principle, and principle fashioned or refined in response to change. Not unity or diversity, but unity in diversity, and diversity which prevents uniformity, the antithesis of unity. End of quote. This is the Catholic genius. Newman would applaud. The Catholic genius is truly comprehensive, and not inclined to exclude, but incorporate, to seek the perfect synthesis. And it is the function of theology, argues Newman, the regulating principle of its life, to articulate that synthesis. But always the efforts of the theologian must flow from that obedience to conscience, and this is our third and final point, that serves as the definitive guide. Newman himself knew the costs that conscience could exact. It propelled him, although given the agonizingly plodding nature of his conversion, propelled may well be an inappropriate word. It took him 5 years to convert. In 1839, he began to have serious doubts about the Anglicans. He thought that they were modern-day monophysites, which nobody else knew about, but he did, through his learned examination of the ancient controversies. And then he thought about it and wavered, and slowly, gradually. He must have been one of the most reluctant converts in the history of Catholicism. It took him years to embrace Rome. And he must have wondered afterwards, was it really worth it? Though he did say on several occasions that he saw no other course. But it took him a long time. He never did anything with dispatch. In fact, when he would write his books, he wrote several books, and as I've already mentioned, 20,000 letters. Very often, each one of these letters and every one of those books would have anywhere between 6 to 10 drafts. And this is pre-computer. You could imagine what this... No wonder he died at the age of 89. Anyway, his close reading of the Church Fathers and the great controversies and councils persuaded him ultimately that his construction of the via media argument to justify Anglicanism's Catholic and apostolic roots for him could no longer hold. Eventually, it was necessary for him to, thread by thread, unweave what he loved. It was, in a sense, the graced tyranny of conscience. His conscience drove him from the church he loved. One should, I think, if you look very carefully at Newman, over the years, you never find him, although sometimes he could be very hard on Anglicans, and clearly was, there was a profound affective bonding with the Anglican Church which was never lost. Similarly with his experience at Oxford. Even though he would leave Oxford and it would be about 30 years before he ever came back, and then not too many years before his death, he never lost that very kind of rooted Anglican sense of being part of English history, of English memory, of being part of that apostolic experience. But his theology, his research, his conscience drove him to conclusions. All his sentiments, his affective structure, his emotions, his own life would prefer not to have followed. Of the power and role of conscience itself, Newman was to write much over the years. But his most extended and celebrated treatment of conscience can be found in his, and I love these long Victorian titles, they read like books themselves actually, Letter addressed to the Duke of Norfolk on occasion of Mr. Gladstone's recent expostulation. Wonderful stuff. Now, that's just the title, folks. An embittered Prime Minister Gladstone, smarting from a recent electoral defeat, it was 1874, which he attributed to the influence of Irish bishops over Catholic members of Parliament, he was right, wrote a highly controversial pamphlet entitled The Vatican Decrees in Their Bearing on Civil Allegiance, in which he concluded that after the dogmatic definition of papal infallibility, Catholics could no longer be loyal Englishmen and Englishwomen. It was an argument that the old Catholics were familiar with from the days of Queen Elizabeth I. The reputation of all English Catholics was impugned, as the credibility of all Roman clergy had been when Charles Kingsley called into question their commitment to truth-telling. Kingsley's charge resulted in the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, one of the greatest autobiographies ever written in English prose, and Gladstone's provocation resulted in his letter to the Duke of Norfolk. As part of his argument showing that the English can be both loyal to the crown and obedient to the Pope, Newman appeals to conscience. And he says, when Anglicans and Wesleyans, the various Presbyterian sects in Scotland, and other denominations among us, speak of conscience, they mean what we mean, the voice of God in the nature and heart of man, as distinct from the voice of revelation. It is a messenger from him who both in nature and in grace speaks to us behind a veil and teaches and rules us by his representatives. And this is a wonderful line. Conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ, a prophet in its information, a monarch in its peremptoriness, a priest in its blessings and anathemas. End of quote. Now Newman is clear on the supreme authority of conscience, and he refers to the Fourth Lateran Council, that's 1215 to 16, which said, and I quote, "He who acts against his conscience loses his soul." End of quote. In addition to several other Catholic sources to argue his case. His peroration is legendary. He concludes with this famous remark that I think many of us have heard in some kind of paraphrased form. Newman says to the ex-Prime Minister, "I add one remark. Certainly, if I am obliged to bring religion into after-dinner toasts, which indeed does not seem quite the thing, I shall drink to the Pope, if you please, but still to conscience first, and to the Pope afterwards." Trying period immediately following the release of Humanae Vitae in 1968. Although there should be no doubt about Newman's strong commitment to the unassailable integrity of conscience, such commitment should not be seen as a way of diminishing the power of legitimate religious authority or of compromising the dogmatic principle, the one remaining bulwark against the ravages of liberalism. Conscience is no more whim for Newman than religion is sentiment. A competent satirist, Newman arranges that his fictional protagonist, Charles Redding, the young Oxford student and would-be Roman convert of his novel Loss and Gain, which appeared in 1848, he arranges that Charles Redding suffers a visitation of proselytizing representatives from the broadest spectrum of British religious life, one of whom, I quote, "a young lady, not without attractions of person and dress," end of quote, embodies the doctrinal free-for-all that Newman loathes. She is about the business of forming a new religious body, and the courteous and besieged Redding inquires, and I quote, "May I ask the name of your intended persuasion?" "The name," she answered, "is not fixed. We haven't decided on the name of our religion yet." Indeed, this is one of the points on which we should covet the privilege of the advice of a gentleman so well qualified as Mr. Redding to assist us in our deliberations. "And your tenets, madam?" "Ah, here too," she replied, "there is still much to be done. The tenets are not fixed either. That is, they are but sketched, and we shall prize your suggestions much. Nay, you will of course have the opportunity, as you would have the right, to nominate any doctrine which you might like to especially incline to support." Charles did not know how to answer such a liberal view. She continued, "Perhaps it is right, Mr. Redding, that I should tell you something more about myself personally. I was born in the communion of the Church of England. For a while I was a member of the New Connection. And after that," she added, still with drooping head and languid sing-song voice, "after that I was a Plymouth Brother." It got too absurd, And Charles, who had for an instant been amused, now became, for one of thought, how to get her out of the room. It was obviously left to her to keep up the conversation, so she said presently, "We are all for a pure religion." "From what you tell me," said Charles, "I gather that every member of your new community is allowed to name one or two doctrines of his own." "We are all scriptural," she answered, "and therefore are all one. We may differ, but we agree. Still, it is so. As you say, Mr. Redding, I'm for election and assurance, our dearest friend is for perfection, and another sweet sister is for the second advent. But we desire to include among us all souls who are thirsting after the river of life, whatever their personal views." End of quote. Now this is a Catholicity of view, a liberalism of sentiment, so madly eclectic and indulgent that dogma is reduced to passing convention and tradition understood as a matter of instant invention. Newman's tribute to conscience is not a celebration of such individualist instincts. He is not partial to religious indifferentism. His own search for the light, for the true, for the real, as he calls it, was a search that often proved a via dolorosa, a way marked by hard decisions, dark nights, misunderstandings and misperceptions, warring ideas and turbulent emotions, an agony and an ecstasy. The teacher in Newman would not abide the easy evasions and the palatable half-truths that could soothe his restive mind and spirit. The teacher in Newman would not tolerate anything less than the searing light. For these reasons, Newman would delight in deflating the pompous, in satirizing the sophist, in pillaring the pseudo-philosopher, skilled at rhetoric but empty withal. In his second novel, Callista, a sketch of the 3rd century, Newman provides us in the person of, and I quote, "the great Polemo of Rhodes, the friend of Plotinus, the pupil of Theagenes, the disciple of Thrasyllus, the hero of Nicomachus, who was of the school of Secundus, the doctor of the new Pythagoreans," end of quote, a type of all those pretentious sages and professors that the master satirist loves to excoriate. And here we have a lovely passage from the novel. Newman writes, he's talking about this Polemo. "As soon as he puts foot on earth, a great hubbub of congratulation and homage breaks forth. He takes no notice. His favorite pupils form a circle around him and conduct him into one of the exedre till the dial shows the time for the lecture. Here he sits in silence, looking at nothing, or at the wall opposite him, talking to himself, a hum of admiration filling the room. Presently, one of his pupils says, 'Hush, gentlemen, hush! The godlike—' No, it is not that. I've not got— Oh, yes. What is his title? 'The Bottomless.' That's it. 'The Bottomless speaks.' A dead silence ensues. A clear voice and a measured elocution are the sure token that it is the outpouring of the oracle. 'Pray,' says the little man, one of the pupils, 'pray, which existed first, the egg or the chick? Did the chick lay the egg, or the egg hatch the chick?' The Bottomless speaks. 'Which comes first, the egg or the chick? The egg comes in relation to the causativity of the chick, and the chick comes first in relation to the causativity of the egg.' End of quote. On which there is a burst of applause. The ring of doors is broken through, and the shrinking professor is carried in the arms or on the shoulders of the literary crowd to his chair in the lecture room. Now, such as these exist in the academy still. Though I'm loath to go any further than this. Newman, the teacher, and he was always the teacher, the doctor, would have no truck with cant, philistinism, and shallow thinking masquerading as profundity. The attraction of Newman for our time, then, by way of conclusion, can be discovered in part in his paradigmatic significance as a modern Christian. Yves Congar was fond of quoting fellow Dominican Henri de Clarissac that it is hard to suffer persecution for the church, but it is harder still to suffer persecution at the hands of the church. Newman would understand. In the gloomy days prior to the Apologia, the days of Rome's blackest humor, 1861, Newman wrote apropos the dilemma facing the educated laity and their clerical supporters, and I quote from his letters and diaries, "I cannot help feel that in high circles the church is sometimes looked upon as made up of the hierarchy and the poor, and that the educated portion, men and women, are viewed as an encumbrance, as the seat and source of heresy, and as almost alien to the Catholic body, whom it would be a great gain, if possible, to annihilate." End of quote. Newman often found himself the underdog, the faithful servant unappreciated and maligned. But he persevered in the face of Roman hostility as he had previously persevered, calumniated by those opposed to religion, by the unforgiving who saw in his departure to the Church of Rome a devastating blow to Anglicanism, and by the old Catholics and the Tractarian converts alike who resented the breadth and depth of his influence. It isn't primarily Newman's suffering, however, that we remember. It is the perduring influence of his life and thought, so wonderfully wed. It is fitting to end then tonight with the following passage from the 1966 Newman biography of Charles Stephen Desine, Newman's scholar, his editor, and a fellow Birmingham Oratorian. He writes, "Newman wanted Catholics to come out of the ghetto and take their place in the world, to adapt themselves, to enlarge their minds in the confidence that truth could never, ever contradict truth, and to be guided like responsible men by their daily enlightened consciences. His views on faith, on free discussion, on the church as a communion, on the place of the laity, whether in the church or in the world, and many other points are now appreciated, as are his return to the source of revelation and his effort to make real the spiritual teaching of the New Testament. This last was meant not only for shouted groups, but for those living in the world, a spirituality for the baptized. In apologetics, his strength lies in his ability to see and state the objections. He has supreme confidence in the power of truth, yet his defense is humble, and does not pander to intellectualism at the expense of mystery. His life was a sacrifice for the truth." In the cemetery at Rednall, just outside of Birmingham, where they bury the Oratorians of his community, chiseled on his headstone are the words, "Ex umbris et imaginagenibus in veritatum," out of shadows and images and into the truth. It's worthy of him. It's the right phrasing. Thank you.